I'd like to address the economic impact of a large country imposing a quantitative restriction or quota on the amount that its producers can export. So we've done a small country export quota, and a lot of the effects are very similar with a large country, but there are some differences. And just to recall the mechanics of an export quota, a government is limiting how much can be exported into the international market. Typically that's either the physical quantity or perhaps the value of exports can't exceed some certain amount. And then that's it. No more can be sent abroad. Now, one of the things that happens when there is an artificial limit on how much of anything can be done, any economic activity can be done, is that there are rents. That is a return over and above the opportunity cost. In this case, a firm that sells domestically will get a lower price than a firm that gets access to the international market where the price will be higher. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a bit. The main difference with the large country, of course, is that there are international effects of the export quota, and in the sense that the price internationally will go up. So we'll talk about this in more detail, but I just want to reemphasize the mechanics of that. Now, the example that I've done already on a YouTube video that you've already seen, I think was not the most illuminating version of a video that I've done. And so I want to sort of strip it down to an actually simpler analysis and to really provide a step-by-step approach of how one might analyze these effects. They're actually very similar to a lot of other supply and demand analysis. So the first thing you need to do is to develop economic intuition about the direction of any price changes. This would be true for tariffs or import quotas or export subsidies, whatever. You want to have a sense of which direction prices will go before you really do anything else, because that will really help you have a sense of what your graph, if you will look like after you start doing the analysis. In the case of a large country, of course, we have to do the domestic price effects and the international price effects. And once we get that down, we could then go to a supply and demand curve, do the analysis more formally, and look at the effects on production, producer surplus, consumption, consumer surplus, any government revenue, the export effects. And so we'll do that using the kind of standard tools, and then we'll look at the overall welfare effects and the implications for international trade. So I've got over here on the left-hand side a price and quantity. Now you'll notice I don't have a supply or demand curve filled in yet, because I want to emphasize that we want to look at the price effects first. So with a country that is limiting how much can be exported, essentially what that happens is it diverts more of the product into the domestic market, and so the domestic price will tend to fall. And the international price with a large country, and I'm going to go ahead and write this up here to really emphasize this, with a large country, the international price is going to rise. And so what you create a wedge, a difference between the domestic price and the world price, which is where the rents come. Okay, so we've got a sense of the directions of the prices domestically and internationally. Now we can put in the supply and demand curves. And I really would emphasize that it's a good idea to do this first before you do really anything else. I think you'll find that that is that will help you a lot. Okay, so first thing, what we have is that at the initial world price, this is the amount that is produced domestically. This is the amount that is demanded domestically. And now prices are going to be made based on, or decisions are going to be made on the new domestic price. And so what we have is that the amount that is produced domestically goes down, and the amount that is consumed domestically is going to go up because the price fell. Now let's take a look at some of the effects internationally. Okay, so this is this horizontal distance is the amount of exports. That's the difference between the supply and the demand. That is being now sold at the international price. Okay, now I'm going to label some of these areas. And let's take a look at this. Now, first of all, let's take a look at the impact on producers. Now, producers are going to be losing through the initial effects because the price that they receive has fallen. So the loss of producer surplus is this A, B, C, and D. It's the difference in the price over the supply curve. Okay. Consumers are going to gain A. So the domestic consumers like that the domestic price has fallen, and so that's that effect. Now let's imagine that, now we have to think about how much the export revenue is. Okay, so once again, this vertical or horizontal distance is the quantity that's being exported. And let's imagine that the government gives away export licenses for free. Okay, the government does not earn any revenue. They may limit how much is being exported, but they give the piece of paper that allows exports to be free. In that case, what we have is that the domestic exporters that are lucky enough to get into the international market get revenue equal to that blue box. That's the world price multiplied times the quantity of exports. So what we have here, so let's think about what these same firms used to get if they sold this same amount under the initial international price. Okay, they used to get, I'm going to do this in green, this amount, and they are earning more by selling this abroad at a higher price. Okay, so what we have is a transfer of E okay, from foreigners to exporters, domestic exporters. Okay. Now, what is the impact of this if instead the government sells the licenses? Doesn't give them away. Instead sells the export licenses to the domestic firms who are going to sell internationally. How much would they be willing to pay? Now, if these firms sell domestically, they get a price of PD1, okay, the new domestic price. If they sell internationally, they get PW1, that's the rent. So they would be willing to pay up to, preferably less than, but no more than the difference between the international price and the domestic price. So that means that if the government sells the licenses, it can gain areas C plus E. Okay, and I want to put an asterisk next to that because this does require that the government sell the licenses. Now let's imagine that what happens if to the net effects. Well, we've got gains and losses on both sides, and if we do the various analysis, then what we're going to see is that there is a gain of E and a loss of B and D. E is the transfer from foreign consumers to the domestic government by way of the higher price that happens as a consequence of the restriction of exports. This is the terms of trade effect. It's very similar to what we had with the export tax. B and D are the deadweight losses, and it could be that E is greater than B and D, in which case it makes sense to have the export quota. It could be that E is less than B and D, in which case it would not make sense. But you do have these terms of trade effects. Okay? Now let's imagine, as we talked about before, that the government gave away the licenses. Now what we have is that the domestic exporters don't have to pay for the licenses. They get them free. So that's essentially a transfer to them in terms of extra revenue that they would get, those lucky few who get access to the international market. And what we see is exactly the same thing in terms of the net welfare effects, and that these could be, E could be less than B and D, or it could be greater than. But what we see is that when we have the restrictions on the exports and the licenses are free, then what we have from the firm's standpoint, from the exporter's standpoint, okay, so let's not think about what happens to the economy as a whole, but strictly to the exporters. Okay, we've got a loss of C and a gain of C. So we have E. Well, actually, let me not go into the details of that. Really, the bottom line is that the transfer from the government potential revenue through the export license auction to the producers offsets some of the gains or the losses to those exporters. The bottom line with this is that it's possible that an exporter may prefer to have a restriction on exports rather than free trade, which really comes to the following implications. You may hear the term voluntary export. Oops, didn't mean to erase that. So voluntary export restraints or a VER. This is when a government will agree to limit the amount of exports to a foreign country, maybe to avoid tariffs, for example. And sometimes people will kind of laugh about this and say, well, it's voluntary because you're being forced into it. It's like, well, of course you would prefer free trade. And it's like, well, not necessarily. Especially if you're a large country, you will have the potential, by limiting the amount that you sell into the foreign market, being able to force the price up inside your foreign market. And if the exporting government gives away the licenses for free, then it's potential that the individual exporters may think, this is a great idea. I may sell less, but I'm going to sell it at a much higher price. So one of the things that you'll see in international trade agreements sometimes is that there is this at least temptation to use a VER, a voluntary export restraint, to get foreign governments, and that, for that matter, foreign firms, to agree to limit exports. Now that attraction to limit exports is why the WTO, in principle, bans VERs, at least since 1995, because it really creates incentives for there to be restraints on exports and less efficiency. So this is an overview of what happens with an export quota with a large country. And again, what you should do when you do this sort of thing, make sure you understand what happens to the prices domestically and internationally. Do the producer surplus and so forth in terms of the welfare effects. Do the net effects and then analyze the effects using the tools that we have developed.